Hi, welcome as we continue to read Philip Simmons' book, Learning to Fall, The Blessings of an Imperfect Life. We find ourselves today at chapter 6, which is entitled, Out of the Cave. So let's see what we are offered. In the first week of April, the wood frogs in our neighborhood scrabble out of whatever muck they winter in and gather at the vernal pool in the woods below our house. Though ice still skins one end of the pool, the frogs are loudly sociable, and for 2 weeks, as I sit writing in my cabin 50 yards off, their raucous quacking is my daily music. In the 2 months between its forming and its drying up, this shallow pool is a busy place. In the second week of April, the peepers begin their nighttime trilling. Tree frogs, leopard frogs, and green frogs wait their turns. On rainy nights, spotted salamanders crawl from beneath rotting logs and make their way there to breed in writhing heaps. As the tadpoles fatten, turtles will claw out of streams and ponds as much as a mile away and travel here to eat them. Raccoon, ferret, and fox venture from their dens to gobble frogs. All around us, life unburies itself. Every few days, my children and I take a bucket and net into the woods to check the pool's progress. Seeing animals has proven difficult. Our clumsy approach sends the frogs diving beneath the leaves at the bottom. On our first visits, we see no sign that all this amphibian mingling had come to much. But at last, my son dips a bucketful of ale-colored water and finds the payoff. Tadpoles no bigger than seeds in rye bread. Looking carefully, we also find squiggling insect larvae, tiny paddling beetles, assorted scooters, blobs, and bumblers we don't know the names of. There's even more we cannot see, all the microscopic floaters and crawlers, the paramecia and bacteria, the broad and invisible base of that great food pyramid at whose pinnacle my children and I are improbably perched. Bending over the bucket, peering past my reflection on the water's stilled surface, I find myself thinking that, first and last, life consists of eating and being eaten. If somewhere along the way we manage to reproduce, so much the better. Food and sex, what else animates us? Ads for Caribbean vacations, featuring tanned flesh and heaped platters, tempt us to spend a week, and a lot of money, thinking of nothing else. But other pleasures, mainly social ones, pull us into the company of others, especially at this time of year. The frog's spring ritual is a collective one, and spring pulls us humans too out of our winter hidey holes. Even the most harried suburban commuter lingers in the morning sun between house and automobile, scouting for crocuses. On weekends, we unbend our winter postures with yard work, hailing neighbors not sighted during the dark months. In our town, where most of us have no neighbors within hailing distance, the urge to see people takes us into the village, where a trip to the post office and general store becomes an hour's social adventure. Traveling a few hundred yards, I'm greeted by a dozen people. A friend stops her car in the street. I stand on the yellow center line, talking through the roll-down window. Our frail elderly, counting their losses and their blessings, emerge from their houses, blinking to greet us in the light of one more spring. We stand in the street holding mail, newspapers, coffee, glad to be alive in that rejuvenating air. On such days, I'm happy to come out of my cave, and am reminded of the enlivening force of community. This winter I spent a good part of most days alone in my 10 by 12 cabin, meditating, reading, and writing. So much of spiritual life involves one's interior journey, yet for most of us spirituality gets expressed, even transformed, only in our relationships with others. Granted, we have to take time out from our routine busyness to develop and bring to the rest of our day's activities that state of calm, alert awareness one observes in animals, whose every action seems to flow effortlessly from their true natures. But most animals, and especially humans, don't live alone. Our relationships with others not only test our spiritual resources, but push us to levels of development we could not attain through solitary practice. More important, our gifts to others are the very fruits of our own self-development. The two forms of life, communal and solitary, are mutually sustaining. Even the Christian desert fathers, those 4th century hermits who sought extreme solitude in the Egyptian desert, understood that simply running away from society would serve no purpose. When one of them told another of his plan to, quote, shut himself into his cell and refuse the face of men that he might perfect himself, end quote, the second monk replied that, quote, unless thou first amend thy life going to and fro amongst men, thou shalt not avail to amend it dwelling alone. These ancient seekers, practicing disciplines unimaginably severe to our caudal sensibilities, grasped a truth lost amid the heaps of self-help books and rarely heard within the walls of the therapist's office. Seeking only our own happiness is the surest way to remain unhappy. As the great monastic and scholar Thomas Merton puts it, isolation in the self, inability to go out of oneself to others, would mean incapacity for any form of self-transcendence. To be thus the prisoner of one's own selfhood is, in fact, to be in hell. Most of us know this. Even if we're drawn to the spiritual life and feel the pull of solitude, few of us these days wish to be hermits. We want our solitude, but we also want to raise families, pursue careers, take part in the wider world, and make a difference to others. Perhaps we're after what was known in Latin as the vita mixta, the mixed life of action and contemplation, in which, as St. Augustine says, the love of truth doth ask a holy quiet, and the necessity of love doth accept a righteous busyness. Lest self-development become self-enclosure and stagnation, we must leave the cave and enter the light of relationship, family, and community. If we accept what all the world religions tell us, that on the deepest levels our separateness from others is an illusion, then our own spiritual self-fulfillment is intimately bound to the fulfillment of those around us. A rising tide lifts all boats, and each of us empties his or her own cup into the ocean of spirit. This truth is grasped by the people whom the Buddhists call bodhisattvas, who refuse the rewards of their own enlightenment and continue in the cycle of death and rebirth in order to work for the enlightenment of all other beings. In this view, we get to heaven together or not at all. Speaking from the standpoint of the self-enclosed, alienated individual, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote famously that hell is other people. Yet, when we leave the cave in a spirit of true selflessness, we find just the opposite. Other people are heaven itself, the place of our full realization as human beings. But it's easy, you might say, for me to wax ecstatic about other people from my solitary cabin in the woods. The only thing hanging on the wall of my cabin is a topographical map of the region, actually 4 such maps cut and pasted together on a piece of cardboard. It's a homely but useful construction, some 40 years old, rescued from my parents' attic. Consulting it and adding the houses built in the 4 decades since the map was drawn, I see that within a 1-mile radius of where I write most mornings, there are at most 6 humans other than me. I know them all by name. Later, when people come home from work, the number grows to 15 perhaps. 5 belong to my immediate family. I go for days at a time without riding in an automobile or seeing anyone I do not know well. What, you might ask, could such a person possibly have to tell you about living in community? I would answer that nothing serves relationships, families, or communities better than a well-cultivated solitude. Of course, solitude has never been fashionable. We are not bears, after all, but primates bound to the intricate and noisy life of the troop. Among humans, solitaries have always excited suspicion and ridicule. Once I told a woman I had just started dating that I was going to spend several days at a Benedictine monastery, living in a cave in the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. By the look the woman gave me, it was clear she figured me for a lost cause, if not outright dangerous in some way she couldn't quite define. Now that we've been married for 13 years, she has learned to tolerate my need for solitude. As it turns out, she has the same need herself. And perhaps what she really feared then was that neither one of us would be very good at managing a household. In fact, we're both good at it. Better, I would argue, for having practiced the arts of solitude. Having given generously and fully to ourselves, we can give generously and fully to each other and our children, and by extension, to our communities. The Chinese I Ching, or Book of Changes, teaches that a healthy family, a healthy country, a healthy world, all grow outward from a single superior person, and therefore directs us to begin by improving ourselves. But becoming a superior person sometimes requires more discipline than even the best of us can muster. For one thing, the vita mixta requires equal attention to both action and contemplation. Augustine's righteous busyness must be founded upon times of holy quiet. Without replenishing ourselves with solitude, we will find that our busyness, all our doing and giving and caring, leaves us only frustrated, resentful, and exhausting. It is so easy to simply get too busy to grow, writes the Benedictine monastic Joan Chittister. It is so easy to commit ourselves to this century's demand for product and action until the product consumes us and the actions exhaust us, and we can no longer even remember why we set out to do them in the first place. Worse, without holy quiet, righteous busyness easily becomes self-righteous. We've all caught ourselves at times when our efforts to do good in the world, to teach our children, help our communities, correct an injustice, have more to do with looking good or proving something than with a genuine, selfless desire to serve. Thomas Merton warns us that he who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening his own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give to others. He will communicate to them nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, his aggressiveness, his ego-centered ambitions, his delusions about ends and means, his doctrinaire prejudices and ideas. And for Merton, the Cistercian monk, deepening one's own self-understanding requires a disciplined practice of meditation or contemplative prayer, made possible only by regular doses of holy quiet. Now, I don't know what your household is like, but my wife and I find that between making a living and raising 2 young children, holy quiet is hard to come by. Sometimes holy hell is more like it. The dog has just muddied the sofa. My son refuses my 14th polite request to pick up his Legos from the floor where I'm walking at great peril to my neck, trying to get to the table set for dinner. My daughter begins screaming that she hates the butterfly she's just painted, and now she's ruined the watercolor for Grandma's birthday she's been working on for the past half hour, with its flowers and tree and rainbow and smiling sun. My wife and I insist that it's a beautiful painting, and Grandma won't even notice the butterfly, which is, we admit, a bit crumpled and deformed looking. Our lovely daughter screams louder. Meanwhile, the house fills with smoke from the fish left unattended in the broiler, giving my wife and me time to exchange only one mutually accusatory glance before the smoke alarm has us all holding our hands over our ears, wondering why God has had to go so Old Testament on us all of a sudden, and just what will be the extent of his wrath. Driving to work or even a trip to the supermarket can seem a blessed escape from the teeming, dense life of the family. Soon enough, though, we find that we are no more superior outside of the home than within it. Far from joyfully embracing our connectedness with our fellow divine beings clothed in human form, we spend our days artfully evading any genuine contact with them. In the supermarket, you spot an acquaintance, the one with the grating laugh and the habit of bragging about her children, and you discover a sudden interest in the pet supplies aisle, even though Fluffy died 3 years ago. At work, you see a colleague approaching in the hall. For 3 weeks now, you've owed him that memo on forming a committee to coordinate the efforts of interdepartmental coordinating committees, and you look for a doorway to duck into. When we do let people get close enough to open their mouths in our presence, we do anything but actually listen to them. We judge, we analyze, we defend. We recall the 3.2 times each week on average that this person has said the same thing for the past year now, and we wonder how many more times we'll have to hear it before one of us moves to the Orkney Islands to raise sheep. No wonder then that at the end of the day it's such a relief to get home. Only when we get there do we remember that it's the people we live with we are most desperate to avoid. Funny how I can miss my wife terribly all day until the moment I walk in the house. We have a wonderful marriage, but some days it seems that the whole point of long-term relationships is to give people time to learn to torment one another efficiently. We become athletes of insult, proud of our ability not just to inflict pain, but to do so with minimum effort. We know a relationship is fully developed when with a single lifted eyebrow, we can ruin someone's entire day. Estranged from others outside the house and finding no holy quiet within it, we go into the cave to seek the holy quiet of solitude. But we must be careful not to think of our retreat into the cave as an escape, for the demons that beset us in our lives outside the cave will surely follow us into it. The Abbot Anthony, one of the earliest and greatest of the Desert Fathers, reminds us, "Who sits in solitude and is quiet hath escaped from 3 wars, hearing, speaking, seeing. Yet against one thing shall he continually battle, that is, his own heart." We must go into the cave then, not to escape our lives, but to go more fully into them, to dwell with deeper awareness and acceptance of all we are and all that befalls us. A friend of mine, a sculptor who works in steel, says, "I have to spend a certain amount of time alone in my studio, or I can't stand to be with people." When I asked whether he did this to escape, he answered, "It's about seeking self-understanding." By self-understanding, he does not mean self-analysis. My friend does not go into his studio to think about himself or his life. He goes there to cut, bend, weld, and grind metal. The Desert Fathers wove baskets of palm leaves, and through mindful absorption in this work to empty himself for a time of the daily demands and petty assertions of his ego. Nor is going into the cave about creating some product. My friend makes no great effort to sell his work. The Desert Fathers sold their baskets and gave the money to the poor. To go into the cave to accomplish something, even self-understanding, even enlightenment, is to risk falling back into the trap that the ego lays just ahead of all our best intentions. As the 13th century Sufi mystic and poet Jalal al-Din Rumi reminds us, no better love than love with no object, no more satisfying work than work with no purpose. You may already have your own way of going into the cave. It may be prayer, or gardening, or yoga, or long-distance running. There are plenty of books and courses teaching meditation from within Buddhist, Hindu, and Christian traditions. I'm not concerned with technique so much as attitude. Though regularity and discipline matter, spiritual practice is not simply about observing routines and rituals. Yoga can be a spiritual practice, or just another fitness regimen. You can carve wood to cultivate mindful awareness, or to produce duck decoys. As the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh says, there are two ways to wash the dishes. The first is to wash the dishes in order to have clean dishes. And the second is to wash the dishes in order to wash the dishes. Only the second way, washing the dishes in order to wash the dishes, constitutes a spiritual practice. We enter the cave only when we dwell fully, mindfully, in the present moment. We enter the cave only when we are willing to empty ourselves of all that our ordinary busy selves hold most dear: our plans, our ambitions, our intelligence, our precious opinions, our hard-won expertise, our reputations, everything within us that desires a reward, a purpose, an end. In this emptying, in this letting go, we make room for something else. We allow ourselves to be entered and filled with that essential goodness that is our surest inheritance. We become more deeply and consciously connected to what is highest and truest within us. We dwell more fully in contact with the divine. When we leave the cave replenished with this goodness, made whole again by this contact with our higher nature, we find ourselves less fearful, more willing to venture ourselves for the good. Conflicts disappear, relationships blossom, communities prosper, love grows. I know this isn't easy. Often my idea of going into the cave is turning on the basketball game and ordering out for pizza. On such days, I can't summon the energy or courage to face myself or others. One of Meister Eckhart's many enigmatic sayings is that God's exit is his entrance. He also says that to the extent that all creatures who are gifted with reason go out from themselves in all that they do, to that same extent they go into themselves. That is, when I truly go out of myself in meeting another person, when in that encounter I can let go of my small, fearful, grasping self, then in meeting the other I simultaneously meet my own highest, truest self. If each individual being is an outflowing form, outflowing from, and point of access into the same divine source that flows through all, call this source God, life, love, Brahman, being, high self, spirit, or what you will, then in opening myself to another's essential nature, I am at the same time opening myself to my own. The biblical commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself is in this light transformed from a moral rule to a profound statement about the nature of relationship. I can only love another only as I love myself. I can love another only as I love myself. Conversely, I can love myself only as I love another. Love's exit is its entrance. We see others as strangers only when we are estranged from ourselves. We can fear in others only what we fear in ourselves. And when we meet a loved one, we are meeting ourselves as the beloved. We all know the difference between managing a conflict and dissolving one. We manage a conflict through discussion and analysis. We gather the facts, assess one another's needs, make lists, divide responsibilities. I'll put the laundry in the washing machine, you transfer it to the dryer. I'll fold it, you put it away. We've all made these arrangements. But we have also known those moments when the need for analysis, arrangements, and lists melts away, when conflict dissolves like sugar in tea. It's in those moments that we go out of ourselves and simultaneously go into ourselves, into our own essential goodness. At such moments we surrender all advantages, give up all claims to righteousness, relinquish all privileges, accept that of being in the presence, the sacred and unfathomable presence of another. A traditional greeting among Indian Hindus is Namaste, said with a slight bow, palms pressed together in front of the heart. Literally, it means, I bow to you, or I salute you, and to an Indian is simply a respectful way of saying hello. Understood within its religious context, however, the greeting acknowledges that the other person is, like oneself, an individual manifestation of Brahman, the sacred essence of all created things. Namaste can be translated more fully then as, I bow to the life spirit within you that is also within me. What a lovely way to greet people. I don't often do it for fear they'll question my sanity. Yet upon meeting someone, I often say this greeting silently to myself. It's especially useful when meeting someone I ordinarily find wearisome, difficult, or threatening. The shift can be remarkable. One moment we're doing what we usually do when someone speaks to us. We're judging, defending, analyzing, etc. The next moment, we're actually listening. Our angry, judgmental, impatient voice doesn't ever go away, of course. With practice, though, you can tune it out. If not forever, then at least for long enough to greet the person rolling her shopping cart toward you now, the person with the expensive hair and neurotic, high-achieving children, the one whom a moment ago you would have avoided by diving into pet supplies, but who now approaches you transformed, face alight with friendship, offering you, in her welcoming smile, a better version of yourself than you thought you possessed. I don't mean to sound naive. There are some people we rightfully avoid, and we need not feel guilty about that. As someone is coming toward me with a knife, I'm not trying to accept the knife wielder within me. And if someone has harmed me, it is right to forgive but not forget, and to take appropriate measures to avoid such harm in the future. When asked about the problem of responding to violence, the Dalai Lama of Tibet replied, "Tolerance and patience do not imply submission or giving in to injustice. What is most important," he says, "is not to give in to anger or hatred. If we cannot control others' actions, we can control our responses to them." Sopa, the Tibetan word for patience, comes from a root that means able to withstand. The truly courageous person, says the Dalai Lama, is able to withstand harm without the mental suffering that hatred and anger bring. The violence I suffer every day is the slow, niggling kind committed by a degenerative illness, bent on emptying me out one teaspoon at a time. Every day I relearn that suffering is an activity of the mind. My hours fill with torment or bliss depending on my own degree of sopa, my ability to withstand physical harm while maintaining an inner calm. It's like learning to relax in the dentist chair. If you could practice during every waking moment, you might get good at it. But my illness is just a particular form of the universal human malady. We all suffer the limitations of our humanness, not just our aches and pains, but our fear, our anger, our pettiness, our grief. Fact is, we do practice being human in every waking moment. And the more mindfully we practice, the more often our conflicts dissolve, the more easily we create new possibilities for relationship and community. On a recent evening, I attended my sons and daughters' first piano recital, a kind of event I normally dread. Children, parents, and grandparents packed the small old church in the village center. Emilia, at age 6, the youngest performer on the program, had to go first, and I endured a stretch of terror watching her march solemnly to the front, climb onto the piano bench, and play a flawless rendition of that immortal classic, Fuzzy Baby Bird. It turned out to be a wonderful recital. Emilia and Aaron played well, but more to my surprise, so did everyone else, and we were treated to what I had least expected, an evening of good music. Still, in the midst of it, I found myself growing sad. With my weakened and trembling hands, I can no longer play the piano or the guitar as I once did. And the more beautiful the music I heard that night, the more keenly I felt the loss. I knew such feelings came from what the Zen Buddhists call small mind, from my grasping, fearful self, unable to let go and simply enjoy the moment. So I took heart, thinking that at least someone was playing, that these children were carrying on where I no longer could. But then something more happened, something I can barely put into words. All of a sudden, it was though I were playing the piano, but playing through these children. Only it was no longer a matter of me and them. We were playing the piano. For a few moments I broke through into what is called big mind, that state of being in which the illusion of our separateness falls away, when our attachments dissolve and we experience the boundlessness of our true nature. Over the years, the more regularly I have gone into the cave, the more often I have these moments of big mind, and indeed the more ordinary they have become. I find myself challenged to imagine what human relationship and community could be like were we to live in such a state always. I imagine living more nearly as animals do, without either the blessing or the burden of self-awareness. What music we could make. I imagine us as frogs in our pool in the woods. Unburdened of self, we have just crawled from the muck, and for one purpose only, to announce our amorous intent, our collective call to love. Learning to fall, the blessings of an imperfect life.